I was definitely a more calculus girl. I did not like linear algebra. When we think about machine learning, there are 4 main branches that we've heard of. So you went from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions. You did not delete any of your variables. Outliers, good. That's your false positive, which is also known as your type 1 error. Here's a general question. In how many phrases can you best describe a person? So if I were to ask you, describe yourself in 3 words or phrases, we would have a lot of things probably in common. You would say good sense of humor, hardworking, curious. But is 3 words enough to capture the essence of a person, to really understand someone's characteristics? No. If I say 10, you can get a little bit more detailed. You can tell me a little bit about your hobbies, about your work, where you were born, possibly. Now, if I tell you, describe yourself in 10,000 phrases or 10,000 words, you're going to get really detailed. You might tell me your blood type, your resting heart rate, but some information in there might be very important for me to know, to understand you as a person. Some might be just a little bit of noise, right? So as someone who's hearing all of this information, I may not be able to detect which one is important, which one's not. Depending on my own biases, I may just get hung up on one specific thing and overlook a lot of other things. So, when does too much information occur? We always want more data, we always want more information, but there is such a thing as too much information when it comes to data. To understand where we're going and how this all applies to machine learning, we're going to take a trip down memory lane to probably middle school when we first saw this for simple linear regressions. We were told what is the relationship between x and y. So x is your independent variable, or you might hear as explanatory variable, and your y is your dependent variable. So the first thing we would do to plot the data that we were given, and then find the line of best fit that would capture majority of your data. And then based on the line you have, you would write the y is equal to mx plus beta. Must be familiar for a lot of the data science people in the crowd. And based on that formula, we would say, if we were given a value of x, whatever x may be, we can predict that the y, or our outcome, is going to be this number based on that formula. Is y going to be the actual population number when we use this formula? No, may not be, because we're using this as an estimation. We're trying to get as close as possible to the population data. So that was for one x and one y. We have one explanatory variable, we have one response variable. What if you have 1,000 or 10,000 or hundreds of variables and data rows? What can we do in this situation? What are some of the things that are coming up? Yeah, so one thing is like we can look at it 2, 3 variables at a time, because the highest dimension that we can visualize is 3-dimensional. We can't go anything past 3-dimensional. You cannot visualize what 100 dimensions is going to look like. No one can. So you can go up to 3-dimensional, you can add colors, you can add shapes, you can add different sizes for your data. That will give you a couple more dimensions. It's going to be a bit harder to understand what your graph is looking like, but that's going to be capped under 10 variables. So you might think, okay, we're going to split the data. We're going to look at 5, 6 at a time. We're going to do this. And then what's going to happen then? You have 100 variables. So let's say you want to look at 5 variables at a time. You have to make at least 20 models. Right? You can say, okay, well, 100 variables, not all of them can be important. Some I'm just going to delete, see where we are. A couple of problems with that. So in simple linear regression, we are assuming that one value of x corresponds to one value of y, and that if you have more x variables, you have more independent variables, they're not related to each other. But in complex systems, especially if, in my case, you're studying biological systems, this is not very easy. So if you want to visualize the relationship between 100 variables, you cannot just simply omit certain variables. You cannot cut them into separate pieces, and this is why. So let's say you have one variable, you have your X1 in your cellular system. This could be a gene, this could be a protein, this could be anything. That is going to promote your X2 is going to promote your X3, but there might be an X4 that also creates your X2, right? There's like two separate genes that correspond to one protein, that protein being X2. There could be an X5 that inhibits that X2. And that X5 not only inhibits your X2, it can promote your X6, that X6 can promote your X7, now that X7 could inhibit your X4. Down the line, your X3 could inhibit your X6, and maybe way upstream there was an X76 that you didn't consider that is actually creating your X5. So if, and this is just an example, if you were to be like, okay, well, I'm just going to look at my X1 through X5, you're missing the rest of this picture. If you're thinking, okay, well, my like X76 is like way upstream, I'm not even interested in that, I'm interested in this. So if you omit everything that is creating X5, you're missing an entire picture. So you're not getting a clear view of your network. And sometimes that may even lead to misinterpretations, because if you're like, okay, well, I'm just looking at X1, X2, X3, there might be a balance between X1, X4, and X5 to create your X2. Does that make sense? So you cannot just cut your data set, pick out, oh, I think this is important, I think this is not, let's see what it gives us. So given that we cannot do that, and oh, this is something called multi-collinearity. It's something that means your X variables are dependent on each other. Okay, this was a little complex. I have another example. So let's say you're trying to figure out what makes a basketball player a good dunker. What makes them dunk very well? So what are some qualities? So we have height, vertical jump, age, and wingspan. Can you expect someone who is taller to have a larger wingspan? Yeah, someone who's 7 feet tall can't have the same wingspan as someone who's 6 feet. That's why we say your variables are related. Or for the vertical jump, someone who is shorter might have a higher vertical jump in order to dunk than someone who's taller. So this relationship between your X variables is called multicollinearity. And we cannot remedy this simply by doing multiple linear regressions. So given we have the curse of the dimensionality and multidimensionality, we can do this. We can visualize our relationships by reducing the dimensions. So when we think about machine learning, there are 4 main branches that we've heard of. And there are many different techniques under each branch. So for example, if you've heard of clustering or k-means clustering, that can be in the unsupervised. But today only we're going to talk about unsupervised and supervised learning. And we're going to talk about PCA, or principal component analysis, and OPLS or orthogonal partial least squares discriminant analysis. I'm not going to say the full word. Yeah. So that's for supervised. So we're going to talk about that. So let's talk about PCA. We've heard of PCA everywhere, and there's a lot of linear algebra that goes into it. There's a lot of, if you ever look up what is PCA on YouTube, you're going to see a lot of eigenvalues. I'm not going to do that. I was definitely a more calculus girl. I did not like linear algebra. The simplest way of imagining how PCA works is using 3 dimensions, because that's the most dimensions we can visualize. So imagine your data in a 3-dimensional space, and imagine it like right in front of you. You have your axes, your X1, X2, and X3, and your data is like right in front of you in a little cloud. Not a perfect circle. It might be a little elongated. Some parts of it may be a bit flat. It can happen. So imagine it's right in front of you. What we're going to do is we're going to put a line of best fit, similar to what we've been doing since middle school, through that entire data set, data cloud. And that's going to be called your principal component 1, or your PC1. Now, perpendicular to that line, you're going to fit another line, your second line of best fit, that captures the second most amount of variation in your data. So for example, if you have an elongated cloud, your first line, your PC1 is going to be through the elongated cloud, And for example, if it's a little flat in the middle, your PC2 is going to be perpendicular to that and in the direction of the flatness of your data cloud. Does that make sense? Good. So now you have one line, your PC1, you have your PC2. What you have is a plane. So imagine the cloud of your data that you have, and you're putting a piece of paper inside it. And that's the plane you have, right? And now, so this is my imaginary data, this is my plane, this is PC1, this is PC2. What I'm going to do, I'm going to shine a light right here. What's going to happen? Shadows, good, because some data is here, some data is here. What we're going to have is shadows, so I'm going to mark where the shadows are. Some are going to be under here, so I'm going to shine the flashlight again under, and I'm going to note where they are, and what it's going to look like is that. So you went from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions. You did not delete any of your variables. You did not have to make any assumptions, and you still have captured all the variations. You have captured all of your data. You just reduced it to 2 dimensions instead. And that's what PCA does. That's the most common practice of PCA. So this could not just be like 3 dimensionals. You could have the 100-dimensional data. You're like, okay, I have 100 dimensions. Give it to me 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions. Does that make sense? I can see some light bulbs going up. It's like, oh, this is PCA. Okay, yeah, this is PCA. So now you have this data, and you're like, okay, what do I do with it? First thing you can do is have a tolerance region for your data. So usually we don't do this by hand. You use a program for this, and it gives you like a 95 or 99% confidence interval. Same thing I've been doing. So one of the ways you can do that is visually, and the visual way of doing it is called Hollings T2, and it gives you a tolerance region, and that is what that ellipses is representing. The other way is using the numbers. So you have the scores, and you're like, okay, well, these data points, they have a score. Some are under the 95% interval. Those are the ones that you want to use. If any of those scores, if any of your data is above that 95 or 99%, what are those called? Outliers. Good. I want to take a moment to talk about the outliers, because a lot of times they're very misunderstood, because we always think, oh, something went wrong. This is not important information. I just want to get rid of it because, like, oh, terrible, terrible. Don't do that. So what you can do is look at those outliers and see what variables, because what makes an outlier an outlier? They're the variables, the score of those variables is either way above your mean or way below your mean. So if you look at your outliers and see what variables have made them outliers, if a measure is too high or too low, that can give you very valuable information about your variables as well. It's not just the clustering. So if there's one specific variable that is always too high, and it's high for all single one of these, you can be like, okay, well, that variable is the least stable of all my variables, right? Like, that is the one that varies a lot. So if your outliers cluster together, yeah, like do a separate analysis on those, that'd be nice. But what you want to do is like, what is making them an outlier? Because your focus of your project is not on the outlier, but the rest of the things that are there. So uncommon, but if you have a cause to do that, absolutely go for it. Identify the outliers, we're going to remove them. Now, you have the main body of your data that you want to look at. What are some of the things that you can figure out from just looking at this? Well, the most important thing that we usually want to look for in a PCA are clusters. So sometimes, and I know this is not very accurate because it was hand-drawn, but sometimes you can see very visible clusters in your data, right? And that's what we want from PCA. Because PCA, the difference between a supervised and an unsupervised is that for an unsupervised, you're not telling your program what you're looking for. You're not telling them the outcome. You're not telling it that, hey, this is my class, this is one class, this is the other, these are my 2 groups. How are they different? You're just feeding the machine your data, and you're like, find a difference. Can you find any difference based on what I'm giving you? So what you're hoping for is to see clusters. Be like, okay, actually my data naturally separates into like very organic little groups. And sometimes these could be like different classes that you're looking at. So you can, for example, see that the red is very tightly clustered together. For the blue and the purple, there's some data points that are not really in that cluster, and yellow, it doesn't have any clusters at all. And that can give you very valuable information about your data as well. Be like, okay, well, based on the variables that I'm looking at, I can't really put all my yellow class into one group. But other ones, yeah, great. So for example, this PCA model works really well if I want to separate the red class from the rest of them. Does that make sense? Okay, so now you're like, how do I know if my model is a good model? And it's not just like giving me a bunch of clusters and whatnot. And that's what we're going to look at model performance. So one of the things that you're going to look at when it comes to your PCA is your R squared and your Q squared values. So the R squared, when it comes to, this is both for regressions, this is for your supervised and unsupervised. So R squared tells you the percentage of variation that your program or your model is capturing in your data. So in simple terms, your R squared value tells you how well your model is fitting your data, and you want this to be high. So for example, if you get an R squared of 0.92, that means the model is capturing 92% of the variation that you see in your data. And the Q squared is how well your model is going to predict unseen data. And that's the measure. So you want the R squared to be high, you also want the Q squared to be high, but sometimes you see this, that your R squared is really high, your Q squared is really low, or sometimes even negative. What does this mean? This means that your model is really good at explaining the data that you give it, but it's not really good at predicting the data that it hasn't seen just yet. And that means your model's overfitted. And this is not something you want. If you have an overfitted model, you can discard it safely. And one thing that comes up, one question that comes up, like, okay, how big of a gap is too big of a gap? That depends on your field. So for that, you have to look into literature and like see what cutoffs, what thresholds people have used in the past, and it's worked really well. For example, for my project, which was like biomarker discovery, it's 0.3. So if I have an R squared of 0.8, my Q squared has to be 0.5 and above. Otherwise, it's overfitted. I can't use that model. So you're like, okay, well, our data's separating. It's not overfitted. Not this one, the last one. It was not overfitted. What is my model using? What variables is my model using to do the separation, do the clustering? And that's when you look at the VIP score, which is known as your variable importance and projection. I never use the full name of things, so it's just sometimes I have to double check, but your VIP score and your loadings. So your VIP score is the weighted sum of squares of the loadings. So it's how important your variable is at giving you these clusters in a numerical, measurable way, in a quantitative way. What you usually want to do for your VIP scores is to select anything that's above 1. So VIP over 1, that's good. Anything below 1, not very important. That's what it means. Above 1, important variable to look at. Below 1, not so important of a variable. So for the one that we had, which variables are important? So yeah, your x1 and your x2, and you're like, okay, well, what about my x1 and x2? And that's when you look at the loadings. So loading in a PCA or in an OPLS DA is how much each variable contributes to your principal components. And you can use this after the VIP because there are multiple ways of selecting which variables are important. And for loadings, you want to look at the ones that have the highest loading, right? So we said that x1 and x2 are potentially important variables, but based on the loadings, if you had to pick one variable, what is the most important variable that gave you those clusters in your PCA? And what we did is feature selection. You've heard this word before, and it's just kind of like, oh, we did feature selection. What does that mean? It means just we went through an entire pipeline of things to do just to find out what is driving the separation. So PCA uses, based on everything we've learned, it's used for a lot of things. So it's usually the first step of your analysis. It's just to get a sense of what your data looks like. Because again, 100 variables, we have no idea what it's going to look like. We reduce the dimensions to 2 or 3, or even 1. You can have just like one principal component. So you get a sense of what your data looks like, what the separation is, what the variation in your data is. And it's really important for your pattern discovery and noise reduction because you're doing dimensionality reduction as well. And through your outlier detection, you can do process monitoring. So like if you are getting data like that is coming in, so if there's a process that's going on and you're receiving the data, you can see if the process is going well, if it's going smoothly, or if there are some hiccups along the way. If there's a specific site, for example, that is not doing very well, you can select that, you can pinpoint those things. You can also use that for quality control and then image and signal compression because you're, again, the dimensionality reduction. PCA is actually, it may be a bit niche sometimes because not a lot of people think about PCA. It's just, you read it in a publication, it's just like, we did PCA, and no one explains what it did or why they did it. But the point, the whole, as a summary for PCA is, if you have too many variables, you don't know what to do with it, you don't know what's important, run a PCA. Like, you cannot lose. So be like, okay, well, if it's too much, if you're like, oh, if I'm asked, for example, in a meeting, what is not important here out of the 100 variables? Run a PCA, the ones with the least VIP or the smallest load, and be like, these are not actually really important. If it's very small, you can actually delete those. It's not really going to hurt your model, right? So you can also do the process monitoring and your quality control that way. Now the question is, what if I don't get clusters? What if I don't get a pattern? What do I do now? Like, don't panic. That is not the time to panic. So first of all, question for the group. What does a no pattern or no clusters in your PCA tell you? What does that mean? All it means is that the variables that you're looking at, they're not really naturally good at separating your data without telling the machine the outcome we're looking for, right? So that's all it means. So in that case, what do? We move on to supervised machine learning, because we said the difference between unsupervised and supervised was that unsupervised, so PCA, doesn't know the outcome that you're looking for. If it's unable to separate your data, if it doesn't know what it's looking for, then you have to be like, okay, this is what I'm looking for, separate them now. Does that make sense? Okay, pop quiz. What is multicollinearity? Multicollinearity means your X variables, your independent variables, or what is supposed to be your independent variables, are actually somehow connected. But you don't want to make the assumption that they're not related and then use another model. For example, if you want to use a multilinear regression, or if you want to do logistic regression, because one of the underlying assumptions for the regressions is that there is no multicollinearity. Like, there is no homoscedasticity. What is the difference between your R squared and your Q squared? Q squared is how well your model predicts unseen data, and R squared is how well your model fits the pre-existing data, the one that you gave it. What is the most common cause of an overfitted model? I forgot to mention this, but there's a very good reason, very common reason, why sometimes your model can be overfitted, and this is the fear of a lot of statisticians. Overfitting means your model is memorizing your data, that it knows exactly where to put the data that you're giving it, but if you give it something that it hasn't seen, it doesn't know what to do with it. And that is a problem you have with very small data sets. And that is why we say, like, have bigger data sets, gather more data, just so you wouldn't have an overfitted model. So your predictions would be better. That's all it means. If you've ever wondered, like, it's just more data, just more work. What do you want it? That's why they want it. So we're gonna move to supervised learning, or the OPLS-TA. So everything that you do for OPLS-TA is very much same as PCA. The only difference being, for the PCA that we didn't have the group labels. So now we have a control group and an experimental group, and we're telling it, hey, these are my groups. I want these groups separated. Separate them. Tell me what you use to separate them at the end, the feature selection. Because you're telling it what you're looking for, you're not going to get clusters. Well, I mean, you hope to get clusters, but you know what you're going to get. You know what your groups are. So another thing you can use, another thing you can interpret that's going to be useful is the shape of your groups. It's how homogeneous or heterogeneous your groups are. So if you have a very tightly clustered group, the blue one, it's like they're only like together here at one point. They're very tightly knit, but and it makes sense in a lot of times. So for example, let's say your control group is the healthy group, and the pink one is a disease one, because you're looking at how a disease works, how you can diagnose it. You don't have multiple types of healthy people, you just have one group of healthy people. So it would make sense that your group is very small on that side. But your experimental group or your disease group, it's spread out over your predictive component. And one thing that I need to point out is that in OPLS-DA, because you're telling it what to look for, you don't have PC1, you don't have PC2. You have your predictive components and you have your orthogonal components. So orthogonal just means anything that's not the variables you already gave it. So any of your confounding variables. We've heard that word before, right? So confounding, it just means you have 100 variables that you gave it. It's anything that you didn't give it. Falls parallel to that orthogonal variable. So if we have a group that is spread out parallel to your predictive component, what it tells you is that within the variables that are separating it, there are some that have higher values of those variables and some have lesser valuables. And for example, and I know it doesn't make sense, we're going to do the example. So for the disease group, you're going to have some people, so you have 10 people with the same diagnosis. Some are going to be very sick, some are going to be okay. For example, cancer, you have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. The ones that fall at the end here, they might have stage 4. That is very, very different from the healthy. And people who are here, maybe stage 1. They're different, not too different. And because there is a more spread, you can even look at subtypes. You might have disease subtypes. And you can look at how severe a disease might get. So the spread that way can give you very, very valuable information. But sometimes it's not horizontal, it's vertical. And we said if anything is parallel to your orthogonal component, it means that your within group variation is not based on the variables that you give it. It could be based on anything else, right? Anything confounding. That can also give you very valuable information. For example, let's say this is based on 10 variables that you picked. Let's say you had 50 variables that you had in your data set. You did your literature review. You were like, okay, well, I have 50, but literature shows only 10 are important. So you analyze, you run your model based on the 10 variables that you have, and then you get something like this. You're like, okay, there is a separation, but a lot of the variation in my group is due to the variables I don't have. So maybe you should look at the other 40 variables that you have as well, see how that shape changes, right? So just because you get separation doesn't mean you don't need anything else. Maybe you need to look into other things. And this can be very, very important, the shape and the spread, if you're doing like biomarker discovery. If something no one's ever looked before, or if there's like a couple cytokines or a couple proteins or genes that it's not in the literature, but you have it, you want to analyze that, and that's how you discover new things. You can use the spread for that as well. So now we're going to look at loading. So the loading for OPLS-DA is going to be a bit different compared to what we saw for PCA. So for PCA, we just saw x1, x2, x3, this is the loading. But we have classes now. So the loadings that we get is relative to the class. For example, we see that x1 is more associated with your experimental group, x2 associated with your experimental group, but x3 kind of a little bit associated with your control group, right? And how you see it on the score plot is that your x1 is very close to your experimental group on the predictive axis, so your horizontal axis, and as you go up and above towards the middle line, towards the orthogonal loading, or you go higher in the orthogonal loading, your actual loading is going to be a lot less. So out of all these three variables, the best one you have to separate your experimental group from your control is your x1. Then your x2, your x3, not very important, because it's very high above your origin, and it's very close to the midline as well. So you want your variables to be as close to your classes as possible. So your control group is here, your experimental group is here. You want your variables to be tightly clustered. The important ones will be tightly clustered. If they're not important, they will be closer to the origin, so the loading of 0 means not important, or they have a loading, but it's not in the horizontal direction, it's in the vertical direction. So it means it might be important. So x3 might be important because it's, the value is higher, but it's in the orthogonal one. So it's not one of the variables it's not one of the variations that you're looking at for your group. Does that make sense? I know it's a bit confusing, but all you need to remember is that instead of PC1 and PC2, you have your predictive and you have your orthogonal, and you want things to be close to the predictive because that's what you're trying to use. So one last thing that is very important for OPLS is that it's going to give you something that is called a confusion matrix. So because you're doing the predictions, okay, I'll start by saying when you have a data set and you're not getting any more data, you should split it into your training and into your testing data set. And you've probably heard this before, your 80-20 split or 70-30 split, right? So the big portion that you're feeding the model is the 70% of your data or 80% of your data to train it. Be like, hey, this is pretty much majority of my data. Tell me how they separate. And then you take the unseen data that machine hasn't seen, you give it to the model. And you're like, okay, now tell me. I'm not going to tell you which classes they're in. Tell me what classes they're in. So, for example, if these are the true groups that are in the data. So we have the controls, we have the experimental, and this is what the machine tells us they are, the classes that it tells us they are. So if it predicts that it's your healthy group, it's the alive group, and your control is, it is the alive group, no one died, you say those are your true negative values, your true proportions. But if the model tells you, hey, this person that you gave us, they died by some animal attack, but the actual was like, no, they didn't, that's your false positive, which is also known as your type 1 error. Or if the other thing is predicted control, they're alive, they actually died, that's your false positive or your type 2 error. And if they predict that, yeah, this person died, and you're like, yeah, this person died, that's your true positive. And you might also hear about sensitivity and specificity. So your sensitivity is the proportion of your actually positive people. So who had it and actually had it. For example, for a disease. A lot of I should have put this in there. There was a meme that is like how to say like type 1 error, type 2 error, and it's like telling an old man that he's pregnant or telling like a very clearly pregnant woman that she's not pregnant. That's exactly that. So your sensitivity is telling you the proportion of people who were actually pregnant over all the people you said that like, yeah, you were pregnant. So your true positive and your false negative, and your specificity is the percentage of people who actually were not pregnant. So your true negative divided by your true negative and your false positive. Does that make sense? Sometimes, depending again on the context, so for a lot of I'm in the medical field, so a lot of the examples I'm going to use is related to that. You want to, depending on the context, depending on what your purpose is, you want to optimize one. You want to be like, okay, actually sensitivity is really important to me. So I'm going to use I'm going to incorporate different variables, find a better model that's going to improve my sensitivity. And that's going to be usually an expense of your specificity. So you're gonna think, okay, which one is more important? And my thesis was diagnosing kids with appendicitis. So if what is more important to me, telling kids that they have appendicitis, even if they don't have it, so I can treat it, or telling kids they don't have appendicitis, even if they have it. So, but there are risks involved with both of those scenarios. If a kid doesn't have it, and I say like, yeah, you do have it, they're going to have an appendectomy for no reason. They're going to go under the knife. But on the other hand, if I want to improve one or the other, I can say, no, you don't have it. Well, they actually have it. The appendicitis can get a lot worse. They can get septic. So depending on what your purpose is, you may want to optimize sensitivity or the specificity. Does that make sense? And this is how you can do it, your OPLS-DA. And it gets a little bit more, we don't have a lot of time to explain the details of this, but how you might do it, you're like, okay, well, how do I know what to do? You can say, this is my threshold. You can say like, okay, if the score went above 0.5, for example, that's a positive. Anything below a 0.5, that's a negative. If you change your threshold, then you change how your sensitivity and your specificity shifts as well. When do we use OPLS-DA? When we want predictive, quantitative analysis. We want to see like, this is the important variable that I want to look at. This is what I want. So feature selection, biomarker discovery, that's when you can use OPLS-DA. If you want to use pattern discovery, noise reduction, also for OPLS-DA. So a little different uses compared to PCA. PCA is just more generalized. Tell me what my data looks like. OPLS-DA is like, no, I want to know what's important. I want to know what to do. You tell me what to do. That's OPLS-DA for you. Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to finish off with an example because I know this was a lot of information. So we're going to see how it looks in a real world situation. So you're an architectural consultant at the city. There has been a growing number of complaints about raising crime rates in a new community. You're tasked with identifying the most effective infrastructure changes that we can build in the city, in that community, to reduce the crime rates in that community. The budget is limited to $500K. You have a task. So first thing you gotta do is to collect your data. Have a good data set, because that's what you're looking at. And you can apply the same principles for this example to your field of study. So you have your data set, you collected the data. Your data set, the data set you are provided with has the following information on 20 communities. So you have 20 rows of data. So first thing is the number of police stations, mean hourly foot traffic, number of schools, location of the community, so if it's downtown versus if it's in the suburbs, so that's your categorical one. So number of parks or playgrounds, number of restaurants, number of public libraries within 10 kilometers, mean number of residents per square kilometer, number of lampposts, number of parking lots, distance to the major highways. So yeah, first you're going to look at this like, this is not a particularly big data set. So there's really, you're probably not going to panic, probably not going to cry, maybe a little bit, but you're going to look at this data set and like, okay, I have a lot of variables, I have a lot of rows, I'm going to run a PCA to see what it looks like. So you perform your PCA. These are your results for your components. So remember your R squared and your Q squared. The green is your R squared, the blue is your Q squared, to see how well your model is performing. What is your conclusion? When do we know how many components we need? You can look at the differences between your R squared and your Q squared. So for example, your component 3, so having 3 components, this is overfitted. So then you look at your first 2 components and you're like, okay, well the difference between This is 0.35, this is 0.2. Let's say we want to have the threshold at like 0.4, for example, or 0.3. So this component 1 is fine, and then these are cumulative. Yeah. So we can also like use component 2. That's fine. Okay. So slightly overfitted. We may not want to use our PC3. So first 2 components will do. This is your score plot based on the loadings. So, okay, this is PC1, PC2, PC3 because it's 3-dimensional. You use all your principal components to visualize your scores, and you see a huge division. You're like, okay, what are these classes? What are these groups? What is this telling me? So you look at the loadings. Based on the loadings, the location of the neighborhood was the main driver of the group separation. So the blue are all the communities that were in the suburbs, and the green is all the communities that are in downtown. What is your next step? So we have a good separation, right? What is being separated? The communities. Good. As an architect, can you do anything about the location of those communities? You can't just take people from downtown and be like, okay, well, you live somewhere else now. You can't just... So is the location of the community, well, it's the biggest predictor here that separates your groups. Do you actually need it? You can tell like in your meeting when it comes up to be like, hey, what should we do? Be like, well, based on our analysis, the location was very important. So if it's a community that's in downtown versus in the suburbs, that can tell us a lot of information, but do you need it for the task you were given? So what you can do is remove the location, exclude that entire column in your data set, and rerun the thing. Because it's just, what are you going to do? Upon removing the categorical location of your communities, you generate your 2-dimensional PCA plot, because we said like the third one was a little overfitted, so you only use the first 2. Also, this is what I wanted to point out. Like P66, these obviously not 20 communities, this is from another data set, but like P66, that's like the row 66, for example, or patient 66, or community 66. Like that's how you know what corresponds to what. Good. So what do we see? Do we see any clusters? When you run the PCA, it doesn't know what you're looking at. So you can color your things based on different variables. So let's say the blue is my communities with the high crime rates, and then the green ones are my communities with a low crime rate. So I'm coloring my data points based on that variable. It is not using that variable to separate them. We're just using it to visualize where everything is. We can do outlier removal. How many outliers do we have? We have 4. However, 3 of the 4 are your green ones. Don't overlook your outliers, because it means like 75% of your outliers here are within the high crime community, so there's a lot of variation. We can remove our outliers. Well, we don't see any clusters. What is our next step? We're going to run a supervised model, because unsupervised didn't give us the clusters. So you perform OPLS-TA. This is your score plot. What is your interpretation? Separation is much better. You can see the green ones on the left. You can see the blue ones on the right. There is some overlap here. So for example, P56, there's something that is making it look more like the blue group compared to the green group, right? So that is telling you something important too. Or like P54. There's another thing. Look at this P49. We said a lot of our outliers are in the green group, right? So this kind of confirms that, like, hey, our green group, very, very spread out. Now we're gonna like, okay, well, we see a separation. It's fine. It's the best we got. What can we do based on that? So you're gonna look at your VIP score plot. Based on your VIP variables, what are the important ones? Are important if we draw a line through 1, so this is 1, and we draw the line here. First 4, right? So variable 3, variable 1, 9, and 2. Good. We're going to select those. Those are the variables that are potentially very important in separating our high crime rate communities from our low crime rate communities. Good. But after that, we're going to look at the loadings. So the highlighted loadings correspond to variables with a VIP over 1, so the ones that we already selected. So that was 3, 1, 9, and 2. What are the best infrastructure changes that you can make to lower crime rates according to your budget of $500K? So what is, based on the loadings, what variable is the most important variable that drives the separation between your high crime rate and low crime rate? What's the number of that variable? It's variable 3. Good, because that is the variable that is most highly associated with your low crime rate neighborhoods. And then after that, you have variable 1. After that is variable 9. After that is variable 2. So out of the 12 variables that you had, you narrowed it down to 4. It would be really great if you could do all 4 in the high crime rate community that you have to lower the crime rate. You have a budget. What are you going to do? So variable 3, the best one that we have, in the data set that we had, that was the number of schools. And it's going to cost too much money, right? That's way over budget. So what's the next best thing? Number of police stations. So when you go in that meeting, be like, okay, well, based on the data that we have, the best thing we can do to lower the crime rates in that community is to build a police station. That is the best one. It's like, well, the first best one would be to build a school. We don't have the budget for that. So after that, we're going to build a police station. Then we're going to look at number 9, which was the number of lampposts. And the cost for 10 of those is $100K. And we have like $30K remaining. So we can be like, okay, well, you can build a police station and 3 lampposts. That's gonna use up all of our budgets, and that is the most efficient and effective way of lowering the crime rates based on the data that we had. This is how you deal with big multi-dimensional data sets without sacrificing anything, because you're still using all your variables, you're still capturing all the variations, you're capturing the most important things that the information that the data set is giving you. That was it. Thank you so much.